On this week's FAS TV, we're in Dumfries-shire at Effgill farm with Hamish, Waugh and Simon Thorp. Controlling bracken in upland areas like Effgill is extremely challenging and can be very dangerous for farmers and farm workers.
We've got 1,146 acres here. We've probably got 7, maybe even 800 acres that are covered with bracken, but the really dense stuff is probably in excess of 100 acres, so that is totally non-productive. And if I could bring that back into production, then that would help my viability no end.
Hamish Waugh has farmed at Effgill for 55 years. Effgill is an upland livestock farm with 600 breeding ewes and 160 hogs, which are retained for breeding.
What we're seeing here is areas of bracken have probably expanded and on a national scale of about 4% per year. And as I say, because of the difficulties of controlling it by cutting or using chemicals that I can use here on the farm, it is a big challenge, because you can see the steepness of the land here. It is not acceptable to ask anybody to go with a wheeled vehicle. And for my small operation, the use of a helicopter here is really cost prohibitive. We've tried cutting and that has limited success. I bought a weed wiper some time ago and used glyphosate in that, which works to an extent, but you're very limited as to where you can use a weed wiper for safety reasons. It's very easy to find a rock hidden in the bracken, and then all of a sudden you've got yourself machining everything upside down, possibly pinned underneath it. It's just not something I would ask anybody else to do. The way things stand at the moment, any dense bracken where there's nothing growing underneath at all, the Scottish Government will not pay the area payment, the basic payment on that. If I am not able to control that bracken, then there's absolutely no hope of me bringing that back into my farming business and claiming subsidy on that land. So that's a great difficulty. I would like to see the availability of chemicals that we can spray from the air at a cost that we can afford, or perhaps persuade government to subsidise the application of these chemicals, because at the end of the day what we're doing is not only improving the area that we're farming, but with access to the general public increasing, we're protecting them from the possibility of picking up ticks as they walk through the bracken. I could probably take you around the corner now and show you lambs that have been bitten by ticks and are exceedingly lame as a result. Thankfully, we don't have looping ill here. Ticks aren't infected with looping ill. I myself have been bitten by ticks, and always very wary that now that Lyme disease has moved from deer ticks into sheep ticks as well, that may pose a hazard at some point. Many years ago, when I first was invited to come into agricultural politics as a member of the National Sheep Association, in those days National Sheep Association had their own Environment and Conservation Committee, of which I was a member. The chairman of that committee, the late Keith McDougall, was very keen to be involved with Heather Trust. Simon was just taking over as director of the Heather Trust at that time. And I suppose for the last 20 odd years we've been worked together very happily and become good friends as a result of it.
I'm Simon Thorp. I'm the coordinator of the Bracken Control Group. I've been working with Hamish for about 20 years, and he's been a member of the Bracken Control Group since it was formed in 2011. So my interest is particularly in bringing together a sort of cross-sector interest in bracken control, such that we try and find the best solutions for managing the plant and also controlling it safely. I think you can describe it as a very successful plant. It's been around for millions of years. It's on 6 of the 7 continents for certain. And part of the challenge of it is that it is invasive. And we're stood amongst it here, and you could see how it has such a tight hold on many hills, but also occurs in the lowlands. It's not just a plant of the hills, but it is very resilient. It spreads through roots in the ground, and it grows up year upon year, getting thicker. And the litter it leaves behind can actually suppress other vegetation. So it's quite a big threat to biodiversity, as well as the farming management of these areas, such as affects the commercial side. Bracken is you could describe it a bit like an iceberg. The plant is the 10% and the 90% is what happens underground. These are the root system called the rhizomes, which are complicated plant structures. And it's the rhizomes you're trying to target with your herbicide. So what you're trying to do is get the plant, when it starts to die back, to take the herbicide into the root system, such that it reduces its ability to regenerate the following year. But the root systems can be very impressive in terms of the amount of material. So you can have 300 tonnes per hectare. Clearly the figure varies between different stands and how old they are, but something of that ilk you have underground. So that's your bit of the iceberg. And they can also go very deep. They can be found meters under the rhizomes. As they start to expand, can be found really deep into the soil, so several meters down. So it's the spread of bracken is through the rhizomes expanding as year on year, and then they pop up new bracken fronds, and gradually the area of bracken expands that way, and then the litter builds behind it. There's no wrong way to control bracken. Some people who have lots of volunteers, who have lots of time and enthusiasm, can pull the bracken up frond by frond. It works, it's effective. Won't necessarily last for very long, but some of the bracken may well come back the next year. But that is one way of doing it. There is bashing it, bruising it, ploughing it, stomping on it, trampling it with livestock. And then there's various chemical techniques with hand sprayers, various bits of equipment, right the way through to the top level, I suppose, is the helicopter, fitted with spray booms, which can then apply Asulam when it's approved. I think the key to this is a balance, and it's a balance of the risk. And what needs to be assessed is the risk of the plant itself. We're worried about the carcinogens coming out of the plant. It is an issue. We're worried about sheep ticks, which thrive in this sort of habitat. So there are big threats. There's threats to biodiversity because it is such a monoculture. So there's that side of the story. Then there's the other side of the story of the risk associated with controlling it. It's not everybody's favoured method to control plants by spraying herbicide. I understand that. But what we need to see is the balance of those risks. And that's where I feel at the moment we're not getting it right. We're not assessing the risks associated with the plant against the risks of controlling it. And I think that we're a bit too focused on the Asulam story, the main herbicide, and whether we should be using that or not what are the risks are associated with the plant. I think the cost of control, it is quite high. If you're getting a helicopter in, there's obviously costs associated with that. To a large extent, they were at least alleviated by the grant available through the AICS scheme. This year, that funding for new schemes has been stopped, but the funding for schemes that had been approved before is continuing. But at the moment, there's no approval to use Asulam in Scotland. So at the moment, there's no aerial spraying taking place in Scotland. There's no funding for new schemes for aerial spraying or for spraying using Asulam, and therefore there is a bit of a hiatus. The cost of the physical work, well, maybe that is something that can be incorporated more easily into the farm budget, but then we have all the other associated risks with farmers driving vehicles through Bracken, as Hamish has been telling us. Bracken is a threat. It is a threat for all the reasons we've spoken about, but particularly to farm businesses. I think it is the key. One of the key messages is you are not going to get rid of this stuff by a one-off hit. You have to be passionate about it. You have to be determined for a period of years to actually go at it, whichever method you choose. Even the helicopter isn't a one-off solution. It needs to be followed up. It'll take the sting out of the bracken. It'll reduce it to a very small level of coverage, but you still need to follow it up. Otherwise, the bracken will return. And it's the same with all the other physical techniques. You are not going to get rid of it in one go. So if you want to control it, you need to be determined. And I think the other thing is that you need to think about what is your strategy. You're not going to get rid of all your bracken, even if you want to. It's not possible. So therefore, it's which bits do you want to control? Look at the priorities. What are the priority habitats? And you may decide the easiest way is actually just to stop it encroaching any further. So go around the edges. Keep it contained into those bracken beds, which may have nothing underneath them, where the edges, where the bracken cover is less dense, may well have other species underneath the grass, which may be a good bite for the sheep. And by controlling the bracken, you prevent any further loss of grazing on the farm.
What needs to be done next to support farmers, crofters and land managers with bracken control?
I think the key thing is to come up with a clear review of this balance of risks between the threats posed by bracken and the risk associated with controlling it. And I think that we need to stand back. The debate has focused too much on the Asulam versus no Asulam story. We need to take a wider view. And I am not prejudging any decision that Asulam will be allowed forever. I quite understand the concerns of using a herbicide in the environment, but at the moment I think it does offer the best form of control, and that we need to carry out control. My message to government is we need to have this balanced view without the time pressure of a ministerial decision in weeks. We need to take a step back, look at all the evidence, look at the knowledge gaps. The James Hutton Institute published a report for Scottish Government in June this year, so rapid evidence review. That has identified quite a lot of detail, quite a lot of knowledge gaps, and we need to take a balanced view of those and decide how we go forward. But just ignoring this problem for another year, waiting for it to come round, it'll end up back on the Minister's desk again in May or June next year, and we'll have, if we don't watch it, we'll have the same sort of furore that we had this year, which I don't think achieved anything for anybody.
Hello, I'm Pernille Jørgensen. I'm a VIO at SIUC in Aberdeen and I work for the Vet Services. Today I'm going to be talking about some common conditions and diseases which might affect cattle on grass. This time of year there tends to be less fresh grass, and we tend to go over to where the grass is growing less, which can cause some challenges. One of the challenges is that the cattle might move because there's less feed in the form of grass to eat poisonous plants. Some of the plants I've seen going on a walk this weekend is we have ragwort, common at the moment, which can cause severe liver damage in cattle. It tends to be a chronic build-up, so they need to eat quite a bit, but when it happens, the liver is ruined forever. So the clinical signs you can see in your cattle would be colic, jaundiced, they go all yellow because the liver is ruined. They can have diarrhea and neurological signs, because when the liver is ruined, they can't get rid of toxins, so it goes to the brain. Another one that's quite common at the moment is foxglove, and I've seen them around too, often in the hedges and along the roadside. They act differently in the cows, and they're not that common to get poisoning by foxgloves in cows, but it does occur. The interesting things about both of these two, foxglove and ragwort, is that when you dry them, for instance, if you put them in hay or silage, they can act still as poisonous when it's dried later in the year. Another common poison in cattle is bracken fern. Plenty of those around too. Apparently they don't taste good to cattle, apart from when they're quite young and green. When they go old, they don't like them later in the year. But again, it's more like a chronic exposure. So you might have the cattle eat them early in the year and then get symptoms later on. And what bracken does is it ruins the bone marrow, which produces white and red blood cells, which means that the clinical signs you would see in the cattle can be that of anemia. And they can even get red tinged urine, which might make you think of red water. But I'll get back to that. Another one, it's a bit early still, but we're getting there, is acorn or oak poisoning. The oaks, the acorns taste quite sour, but some cattle appear to get sort of a fetish for it. They crave it for some unknown reason and would seek them out over other grass available. And similar to some of the other toxicities, what you would see is they would get diarrhea. First they would get constipation, then like a dark diarrhea and colic, and what ultimately kills them is kidney damage. Irreversible kidney damage. Something else to pay attention to in the autumn, late summer, autumn, another kind of poisoning that we can't really see and is from something that the cows eat a lot of, which is grass. In the autumn, when we move adult cattle, sometimes you move them from a sort of not lush grass to a lusher green grass, and that can cause a poisoning within the cattle from the grass. So it happens because they eat this fresh grass that is full of protein, which gets then degraded in the rumen, the forestomachs, too quickly, which causes a product to go into the lungs, which causes them to get pneumonia. And they will die pretty quickly when they get to this stage. The main differential is husk. You can get, I think my colleague Helen talked about husk a couple of times ago. Lungworm infection, where you can get an anaphylactic sort of reaction, where you can also get sudden death in these adult cattle. So that's worth considering too. A post-mortem examination is the way to figure it out, what causes the death. I mentioned red water before as a cause of blood in the urine. So tick-borne diseases is definitely also something to bear in mind. They seem to be restricted to the areas or hills, even lowlands, where there are ticks, infected ticks. We see 3 diseases mainly here in Scotland, and that is tick-borne fever, which is caused by a bacterium. We get louping ill, which is caused by a virus, and babesiosis, which is caused by a parasite. So these ticks can harbor many different pathogens. For the tick-borne fever, the bacterium goes in and ruins, it destroys the white blood cells, which makes the animals more susceptible to infection, being that Pasteurella or other things, bacterial infections. And it might hinder the efficiency of the vaccines. The louping ill, sheep are more affected than cattle, and it goes to the brain and causes an infection. So you would typically see neurological signs in your sheep if they have louping ill. Babesiosis is also commonly called red water because it causes an anemia, a destruction of the red blood cells in the cows, and that's mainly a cow disease. That's it for today. Thank you very much for watching, and see you next time.